Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the MedSafety Exchange webinar series, a joint venture by the Institute for Safe Medication Practices Canada, ISMP Canada, and the Canadian Patient Safety Institute, CPSI. As always, this webinar will be recorded, and the link to the recording will be posted on the MedSafety Exchange website about a week later. We do have all the lines muted, so we ask you to submit any questions or comments and type them to us in the chat box or the Q&A box so that we can read them out loud at the end of the webinar during the discussion period. The purpose of this webinar series is to encourage reporting, sharing, and learning of medication incidents and medication safety topics to bridge the silos in healthcare and optimize med safety in all care sites. As a reminder, to garner as much feedback as possible, we've developed several new questions for the post-webinar survey, but being respectful of your time, we will be rotating the questions through each webinar. So please ensure that you read each question each time because they won't be the same webinar to webinar. You will have multiple opportunities to respond to the webinar questions, including the poll at the end of the live webinar that's shown on the right panel, the pop-up web page after you close the webinar window, which looks like this, as well as the attachment in the thank you for attending email that's sent out about a week later. Now for today's overview, this webinar will hear about an incident of methotrexate toxicity when it was inappropriately given to a patient receiving dialysis, and we'll hear from Health Canada regarding the naming convention for biologic drugs, including biosimilars. This will be followed by an observatory with updates from CIHI, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, and from CPSI. At the end, we'll have a discussion period where we read out your questions and we allow our presenters to respond. We respect the anonymity of all those involved in the webinar, so I'll only introduce speakers briefly, and they can choose to share as much or as little as they'd like about themselves and or their practice site. I'd now like to turn it over to our first speaker, who will be describing a medication incident with methotrexate in a patient receiving dialysis.
Thank you very much, Ambika and ISMP Canada, for inviting me to present this important case in an effort to try and prevent it from happening in the future. So let's meet the case. This is Mrs. Lucky to be with us. She's an older female who has been on peritoneal dialysis for about 3 years. She has a history of polymyalgia rheumatica, which has been stable until recently. She was recently started on methotrexate 12.5 milligrams once a week orally. So the case summary is that the patient saw a rheumatologist for this potential flare of PMR. She had symptoms of the flare, but then blood work revealed an elevated ESR. So the rheumatologist prescribed methotrexate 25 milligrams PO once weekly. The patient was reluctant to take steroids. She'd had some side effects in the past. The community pharmacist knew that the patient was on dialysis and contacted the rheumatologist to reduce the dose by 50%. But unfortunately, after just 2 doses, the patient developed severe mucositis and pancytopenia. She was admitted to hospital and received vilgrostim. So what were the rheumatologist's actions in this case? Well, the rheumatologist, of course, diagnosed the patient with the flare of the PMR, prescribed the methotrexate 25 milligrams once weekly, as I mentioned, because the patient was reluctant to take steroids. The rheumatologist communicated with the community pharmacist regarding the recommendation to reduce the dose by 50% because the patient was on peritoneal dialysis and methotrexate is renally eliminated. So agreed to change the prescription to the methotrexate 12.5 once weekly. So the community pharmacist in this case did receive the initial prescription, which was for the full dose, 25 milligrams of methotrexate weekly. And the patient is on dialysis. So checked his usual dosing references and recognized that methotrexate did need to be reduced in dialysis. Then went ahead and contacted the rheumatologist and reduced the dose by 50%. He then dispensed the new prescription for the half dose of methotrexate once weekly. So how was the error recognized? So the patient ended up calling our PD unit after taking her second dose of methotrexate. She was complaining of mouth sores and just generally feeling unwell. She stated that she was started on a new medication by the rheumatologist, so I contacted the community pharmacy and discovered that the new medication was methotrexate. We contacted the PD unit, then contacted the patient. We discontinued the methotrexate, asked the patient to do blood work as soon as possible, and ordered some nystatin mouthwash. So here's the patient's outcomes. She did unfortunately develop significant toxicity despite only receiving 2 doses and even with the 50% dose reduction. So as you can see, her baseline blood work is actually normal, and she for a dialysis patient, and it was taken about a month before she started on the methotrexate. So day 0 was her first dose of the 12.5 milligrams methotrexate, and then a week later she took her second dose of 12.5 milligrams methotrexate. And then just over a week after that, she presented feeling unwell with the mouth sores and had blood work done at her local ER, and it revealed neutropenia and thrombocytopenia. She was admitted and transferred to our hospital, where she did receive filgrastim and was discharged just about a week later when her counts recovered. So luckily, this patient did recover. So how could this happen? Well, rheumatologists would be less likely to know what doses are required for dialysis patients for medications. Unfortunately, the medication did not get entered into our EMR, so did not have the trigger of looking at the patient's renal function, or there were no drug warnings that populated to kind of guide that this might be an issue. The community pharmacist did identify, thankfully, that there is a concern with methotrexate dosing in a dialysis patient, but didn't recognize that it should actually be contraindicated. And this is in part because of confusion with some of the references. Certainly some state to avoid, but some say you just need to reduce the dose by 50%. And the patient, unfortunately, didn't call us at the PD unit to review the new medication before starting. And she does live quite a distance from our unit, so was not able to come in and have blood work done. So this is an unfortunate case that happened in Ontario, and there was a coroner's inquest into the death of a patient who's on hemodialysis who received methotrexate for sarcoidosis. Unfortunately, shortly after the patient started on the methotrexate, developed mucositis and pancytopenia. The patient unfortunately died of sepsis from the methotrexate-induced pancytopenia. So some of the recommendations that came out from this coroner's inquest, I've just briefly tried to list them there below. So medications, if they're ordered for a dialysis patient by a non-nephrologist, should be checked for appropriateness with a nephrologist. You should have a standardized process in place to ensure that new medications are reviewed with a renal pharmacist or nephrologist. Patients should be instructed to notify the dialysis unit when started on a new medication. And if there's ever a new immunosuppressive prescription for a patient with renal disease, even if they're on dialysis, it should be reviewed with a nephrologist before a patient receives the first dose. So what did we do to try and prevent this from happening again? So we educated staff, tried to enhance our EMR, contacted drug information providers, improved medication management process, and shared in the learning. For our education piece, the usual prescribers of methotrexate, so rheumatologist, respirologist, gastroenterologist, and our pharmacist, nephrologist, were all reminded to avoid using methotrexate in dialysis patients on dialysis. This case was presented at quarterly pharmacy staff meetings and our pharmacy incident rounds. In terms of our EMR, we're creating an alert for prescribers. So if they try to order methotrexate and the patient has also been ordered a prescription for dialysis, this alert will populate. And it suggests avoiding the drug if possible and promotes the practice of contacting the nephrologist prior to initiating the methotrexate in a patient who is receiving dialysis. And all prescribers are asked to try and use EMR when entering outpatient prescriptions. This gives them access to the patient's renal function, and then drug disease alerts will populate and try and warn them if it's prescribed. I contacted some of our usual drug information resources, so eCPS, Lexicom, Micromedics, and asked them to update their dosing recommendations for methotrexate in patients receiving dialysis in order to try and standardize the drug information out there. And according to our current Canadian product monograph, methotrexate is contraindicated for patients with severe renal impairment, whether they're on dialysis or not. However, there is some of the other references are much less explicit in their cautions, and they do not highlight methotrexate as a drug of concern for patients on dialysis, so this is very concerning. So Health Canada has luckily been working and partnering with the manufacturers of methotrexate in Canada, and they have been working to harmonize and update and clarify the dosing of methotrexate. So the key message in this bulletin is methotrexate is contraindicated in patients with severe renal impairment, including end-stage renal disease with or without dialysis. So our medication management process, we're in the process of updating this to try and include some of the coroner's inquest recommendations. So those being if a new medication is prescribed by a non-nephrologist, we'd like it to be reviewed by the renal pharmacist or the nephrologist. And at each appointment, patients are reminded to always let us know if they're started on a new medication. Created a new list of contraindicated medications in dialysis, and so if a patient presents tells the nurse or the dialysis unit that they've been started on a new medication that's on this contraindicated list, the nurse must immediately contact the nephrologist for advice. So reporting and sharing, I think that's the only way we can try and prevent this from happening again. Our hospital or institution system is called AIMS, so certainly would report using that. And then Health Canada, ADR, the Canada Vigilance, the ISMP Canada, the IPR, and then in Ontario we have the AIMS, the OCP required reporting. In our case, we also sent a letter to the community pharmacist recognizing his diligence in this case, certainly potentially saved this patient's life. And I think the only way we can kind of prevent this in the future is certainly sharing the learning that we've had from this experience in case. And you can make a difference. So I was quite pleased that when I contacted some of the drug information resources, they were open to clarifying the risk of methotrexate in renal patients. So Micromedics is agreeable to updating and that dosing information. And I think I also mentioned already that the Canadian product monographs are also being updated to have a more straightforward and standard approach, saying that it must be avoided in patients who have kidney disease with or without dialysis.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that incident and the great steps that you took at a system level to have that clinical information standardized for practitioners. It's great to hear that they were really responsive to you as well. We did also develop a safety bulletin that looks at this incident and the coroner's inquest that was mentioned earlier to focus on methotrexate safety in patients receiving dialysis, so that will be coming out later this month. So in terms of some key learning points from this presentation, for patients receiving dialysis, all healthcare practitioners should regularly review their medications and confirm with the dialysis team the appropriateness of any new medications, and also enable or refine the drug-disease interaction checking function in the computer software system. So this could be the EMR or EHR for prescribers or the pharmacy software for pharmacists, and liaise with the software vendor or IT to suggest clinical resources to inform and improve this checking function. So this will necessitate identification of and access to up-to-date disease lists and medication lists with relevant safety concerns. As well, some questions to consider as you reflect on the learning from this presentation and how it can impact your work. Do you have a process that identifies the patients in your practice that are receiving dialysis or have renal impairment? Is there a designated field within the patient's profile to document this information? Are your drug information resources up to date? How do you ensure your electronic or hard copy resources are the most current available? I'd now like to invite our second speaker from Health Canada to describe an important naming policy to distinguish among biologic drugs, including biosimilars.
Hello, I'll be speaking today about Health Canada's naming convention for biologic drugs, including biosimilars. I thought I'd start with a little background information on biosimilars. Biosimilars are biologic drugs. They're made from living organisms or from their cells, often using biotechnology. A biosimilar is a biologic drug that is highly similar to a biologic drug that was already authorized for sale, known as the reference biologic drug. There are no expected clinically meaningful differences in efficacy and safety between a biosimilar and its reference biologic. Health Canada has a robust, science-based regulatory framework for authorizing biosimilars. Biosimilars are manufactured to the same regulatory standards as other biologics and are authorized after a scientific evaluation by Health Canada. We have authorized 18 biosimilars to date, and there are additional biosimilars on hold due to intellectual property issues such as patent protection. It's important to note that biosimilars are not generic drugs. Generics are chemically produced small molecules that contain identical medicinal ingredients to their reference products. As I said, biosimilars are biologics and are large, complex, and naturally variable. Because of this, they can be shown to be highly similar but not identical to their reference products, and we require more studies for authorization of a biosimilar than for a generic drug. The diagram in the lower left of this slide gives a quick visual of the difference in size and complexity between a pharmaceutical generic drug such as aspirin on the lower left and 3 different biologics, insulin, erythropoietin, and a monoclonal antibody. So our role at Health Canada is to authorize biologic drugs, including biosimilars, for sale. But with the entry of biosimilars onto the market, people have questions about changing from one biologic drug or biosimilar to another. And this is important context for biologic naming because the objectives of our naming convention include distinguishing among biologics for prescribing, dispensing, and pharmacovigilance. Health Canada's Biosimilars fact sheet, which is available on our website, outlines our positions on switching. In the context of biosimilar use, we consider switching between authorized products to refer to a change from routine use of one specific product to routine use of another specific product. Patients and healthcare providers can have confidence that biosimilars are effective and safe for each of their authorized indications, and no differences are expected in efficacy and safety following a change in routine use between a biosimilar and its reference biologic in an authorized indication. Switching is distinct from interchangeability. In Canada, interchangeability often refers to the ability for a patient to be changed from one drug to another equivalent drug by a pharmacist without the intervention of a prescriber. Unlike generics, our authorization of a biosimilar is not a declaration of equivalence to the reference biologic drug. The authority to declare 2 products interchangeable rests with each province and territory according to its own rules and regulations. This brings us to the issue of biologics naming. As biosimilars enter the market, the number of biologics with the same non-proprietary or active ingredient name is increasing. For example, we have authorized 4 biologics with the non-proprietary name infliximab, the reference biologic drug Remicade, and 3 biosimilars, Inflectra, Remsima, and Renflexis. This led to calls for a naming convention that would distinguish among biologics for prescribing, dispensing, and pharmacovigilance. However, different stakeholders had differing views on biologics naming, and different jurisdictions have taken different approaches. In the United States, biologics and biosimilars receive a 4-letter suffix that is devoid of meaning. For example, the example shown is infliximab-DYYB. In Japan, biosimilars receive a numerical suffix that denotes the order of approval. And Europe and Australia have taken a different approach, and they've taken brand name-based approaches to biologics naming. The World Health Organization proposed a suffix term called the biological qualifier, but then decided not to proceed. So it was in this context that we sought information on which approach to biologics naming would be best suited for Canada. To seek input from Canadian stakeholders, we conducted an online consultation in collaboration with ISMP Canada. The objectives of the consultation were to seek input on 3 proposed options for biologics naming and to better understand the impact of each option. Our primary target groups were healthcare providers, patients, manufacturers, IT providers, and insurers. We received 362 responses to the consultation. They were mostly from healthcare providers, particularly pharmacists, and we also heard from the other target groups. We proposed three options for biologics naming in the consultation. Option 1 was to continue the status quo by which biologics are authorized with brand and non-proprietary names, with the note that in some settings only the non-proprietary name is used. Option 2 was use of the brand name with the non-proprietary name. And option 3 was to adopt a 4-letter suffix aligned as much as possible with the United States. You can see from the results that the majority of respondents rated the status quo as not acceptable. Option 2, use of the brand and non-proprietary names, was rated as preferred or acceptable by 3/4 of respondents and not acceptable by 1/4. And views were evenly split on the suffix, with approximately half of respondents rating it as preferred or acceptable and half rating it as not acceptable. Overall, option 2, which was the use of both brand and non-proprietary names, was the most favored by respondents. In addition, when considering the suffix-based option, over 80% of respondents told us that they would want previously authorized biologics to be renamed if we were to adopt suffixes. Adverse drug reaction reporting, or ADR reporting, was also a key factor in our decision, since product-specific identification is critical for traceability of an ADR to a specific suspect drug product. Health Canada's Canada Vigilance database collects ADR reports for marketed health products. We analysed how biologic drugs, including biosimilars, were identified in ADR reports in the Canada Vigilance database. The results of our analysis found that for biologics, reporting by brand name is largely successful in achieving accurate product-level attribution of spontaneously reported adverse events. The traceability of biologics that are primarily used in hospital settings was identified as an area for improvement. In February 2019, we published our decision on biologics naming. Biologic drugs, including biosimilars, will be identified by unique brand name and non-proprietary name without a product-specific suffix. This naming convention will distinguish among biologics in prescribing, dispensing, and pharmacovigilance, and also avoids the complexity associated with renaming previously authorized biologics. Under our naming convention, all biologics will have a unique brand name, a non-proprietary name that is shared by biosimilar and reference biologic drug, and a unique drug identification number, as well as a lot number. We recommend use of product-specific identifiers, including the brand and non-proprietary names, throughout the medication use process and in adverse drug reaction reporting. To implement our decision, we have updated the product monograph templates for biologics and biosimilars to communicate the importance of recording the brand and non-proprietary names, as well as other product-specific identifiers for traceability. We've also updated our biosimilars fact sheet with information on biologics naming. And we're updating guidance documents and plan to amend the Food and Drug Regulations to support the current practice whereby biologics manufacturers submit unique brand names when seeking authorization from Health Canada. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the results of the Canada Vigilance analysis identified the traceability of biologics used in hospital settings as an area for improvement. In implementing our decision, we leveraged the activities underway for mandatory reporting of serious adverse drug reactions by healthcare institutions. In particular, the new ADR reporting form for healthcare institutions contains separate boxes for brand and non-proprietary names, as well as instructions highlighting the importance of providing product-specific identifiers for traceability. We will also continue to analyze the Canada Vigilance database to monitor ongoing traceability. Finally, I wanted to provide links for further information on biosimilars and biologics naming material that's available on our website. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the webinar.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that medication naming policy with us, and especially for providing some context and the decision-making process from Health Canada's perspective. So again, some key learning points to take away from this presentation are that there are no expected clinically meaningful differences in efficacy and safety between a biosimilar and its reference biologic drug in an indication that is authorized by Health Canada. So this does not, however, mean that they are interchangeable at the pharmacy, because that's determined by each province or territory. As well, Health Canada recommends that both the brand name and the non-proprietary name be used throughout the medication use process and for ADR reporting. So an example of a biosimilar's brand and non-proprietary name are provided, although the order in which this information is presented is not specified in the policy, so you'll have to determine what works best for your practice. As well, some statements to consider as you reflect on the learning from this presentation and how you can implement this naming policy in your practice. So review your computer software systems to ensure they can accommodate both the brand and non-proprietary names of biologic drugs, including biosimilars. Review your local drug references, pre-printed orders, and other resources to ensure they can accommodate the new naming convention. And think about additional strategies that you can incorporate in your practice to help distinguish among biologic drugs, including biosimilars. So we'll now get into the Observatory for some quick med safety updates. First up is CIHI to describe NSIR and its important outputs for medication safety.
Thank you, Ambika. My name is Annie Walker, and I'm a program lead for CIHI for incident reporting. I thought I might, next slide, sorry. There we go. I thought I might start by telling you a bit about CIHI, or the Canadian Institute for Health Information, a not-for-profit organization established in 1994 through an agreement between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. For the past 25 years, it's been CIHI's responsibility to provide and publicly report on health data and information in health system performance and population health across the country. CIHI is funded by Health Canada and negotiated agreements with the provinces. It's led by a 16-person board of directors made up of senior health system leaders in the country. In 2010, CIHI formally launched the National System for Incident Reporting, or NSIR. NSIR is a web-based application used by Canadian healthcare facilities to securely share medication incidents, and as of 2017, also radiation treatment incidents. NSIR collects voluntary and anonymous incident reports from participating facilities, allowing them to share their experiences and best practices, also learning from others. Users gain insights by investigating similarities in incidents to reveal sources of risk and underlying system failures. While remaining anonymous, facilities speak a common language using the NSIR data aligns with the WHO taxonomy and uses Health Canada's drug product database so that standardized, detailed drug product information can be collected for analysis. NSIR does not collect any patient or provider identifiers. There are 700 facilities across Canada participating in NSIR. The database has over 60,000 medication incidents, and in the last couple of years has collected over 4,000 radiation treatment incidents from participating Canadian cancer centers. Knowing that many facilities have their own reporting system, NSIR also accepts batch submissions, eliminating double data entry. For almost 5 years now, British Columbia's Patient Safety Learning System batch uploads multiple incident records to NSIR, so enhancing the process by implementing an API, or an Application Programming Interface, for radiation treatment incidents to allow for direct system-to-system transfer of the data seamlessly to NSIR. If you're interested in learning more about email us, and we'd be happy to provide a demonstration. NSIR is part of a larger collaborative called the Canadian Medication Incident Reporting and Prevention System, or CMIRPS. Working with Health Canada, the Canadian Patient Safety Institute, and Patients for Patient Safety, NSIR shares information with CMIRPS partners who use the data to reduce and prevent harmful medication incidents in Canada. For example, Health Canada reviews NSIR packaging and labeling incident types as part of their ongoing activities to monitor and improve the safety of medications and other health products sold in Canada. Similarly, ISNP Canada accesses NSIR data for analysis and follow-up of incident reports, performs their work in developing and implementing preventative measures and other recommendations. One key output from NSIR is the quarterly eBulletin. It's available online at our website and also by subscription. The eBulletin is where you can find examples of how the data submitted to NSIR can support risk management activities, patient safety research, or perhaps policy changes. Articles include summaries of the data reported to NSIR, to specific partner recommendations, many from ISNP Canada. It presents the system issues found in the data alongside with potential solutions. In the future, we hope to work more closely with our partners, stakeholders, and data providers to informative analyses that facilities can take action on to improve patient safety locally. Having specific case examples and success stories will help to promote more sharing and learning through NSIR. So to conclude, I just wanted to show you a short list of some of our past topics that our eBulletin has focused on. If you're interested in any of these topics, I would encourage you to visit our website at cihi.ca or email us to subscribe. And if there's something that you're interested in exploring in NSIR data, please reach out to us and let us know. It could be the topic for our next eBulletin. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that. NSIR has such an important role in medication safety. We will now have CPSI update us on a recent med safety initiative.
So we've been working on a medication safety self-assessment focused on never events, which interestingly was the top item on the CIHI report. So I think that leads nicely into what I wanted to talk to you about is that we now have available this updated self-assessment. And I guess I'll start by defining what a never event is. Basically, it's a patient safety incident that can result in serious harm or death and that can be prevented by using organizational checks and balances. So the important thing about these are incidents that have already been reported and that we know that there are preventive strategies that we can implement. And So we released these new self-assessments in July following a pilot test that was done last winter. And so the final versions do incorporate feedback that we received from the organizations across the country that participated. So if you could just jump up 2 slides, Ambika, this slide shows the national participation, and we were so thrilled that we had participation from across the country from both long-term care and acute care. And this pilot was run over a very short time period in December and January, running in from 2018 into 2019, so a very busy time of year. And we had, I think, over 75 people who registered and 34 who actually completed the assessment. And of the 34, 21 were hospitals, 24% long-term care, which is 8 facilities, and then 2 complex care and rehab, and then 3 ambulatory care centers. So while the numbers are small, we did have representation across all sectors. And so this next slide is just showing the overall feedback from and results from the acute care sector. And so these are the 24 facilities, and the pilot assessment was divided into 12 sections. The first section is specifically focused on never events that were identified through a report developed by CIHI and CPSI, and the second section is on general strategies for safety, and then all of the other sections focus specifically on a high alert drug category. And so you can see that there's some variation among the people who responded. The gold bar is the average score, and the red line is the standard deviation. So certainly more variation in some areas than others. But going to the next slide, so in our first section, we wanted to look at these what we call the known never events. So these were the ones that were highlighted in the CPSI CIHI report, and they focused on sort of 5 specific pharmaceutical events along with allergy documentation procedures. So the 5 specific events are avoidance of parenteral syringes for topical medications, and particularly focusing on local anesthetics in the operating room, and then administration of vincristine. So we know that there have been over 50 incidents worldwide where vincristine has been administered intrathecally in error, and so the system-based fix for that is to dispense it in a mini bag, and the second fix is to make sure that where there are intrathecal medications being administered to a patient who's also receiving vincristine, that the 2 drugs are not dispensed together, and that confirmation is required before the vincristine is dispensed. Then concentrated electrolytes not being available in care areas is something we've been working on since the early 2000s. High-dose, high-concentration opioids not available in care areas as routine stock, and that ensuring that ventilatory support is always in place before a paralyzing agent is administered. So there were 7 specific questions about these never events, and the next slide just shows the acute care response, and you can see that the responses were generally quite high. And so this is something that we're really happy to see that there had been uptake of these strategies. And 1.6, which is the lowest, not too surprisingly, is related to the high-dose, high-concentration opioids, which can be more challenging to manage. So we did look at both the acute care and long-term care data separately. And so the next slide just shows the long-term care data. And because we allowed a not applicable option, and of course many items would not apply to long-term care, you can see that they had very high scores, and really those 100% scores are in areas where the particular item didn't apply. So for example, paralyzing agents are never used in long-term care, and so they therefore don't represent any element of risk. And then the next slide is just looking at those 7 never events questions. And again, so the first one is about allergies. Other than item 1.6, the others don't apply in long-term care. So this really led us to thinking that we probably needed to create a separate assessment with long-term care, which is what we did. I also wanted to share with you that about half of the participants who who completed an assessment also participated in our feedback evaluation, and we were really pleased to see that the vast majority indicated that the learning that they gained from the program relative to the time invested was very high. And almost everyone, we had another question that asked whether they would take any particular actions, and I think it was, again, 95% of people said that there was something they were going to do immediately following the assessment. And then the other feedback item we were really pleased to see was that 100% of people who answered the survey said that they would recommend this assessment to a colleague in another facility. And so that really leads us into why I wanted to talk about this today. First of all, to let you know that there are now 2 versions, and they were designed to be completed by an interdisciplinary team in a single meeting. So the acute care one is 108 items, the long-term care is 48 items, and these are all about critical incidents and high alert medications. So if you think about the level of risk, and if you were going to do an assessment in your organization, these are going to identify your high priority vulnerabilities. And so with the launch of our new version, we are hosting another national snapshot and really trying to recruit participants to sign up and plan to complete this with your med safety team or your pharmacy and therapeutics committee. The snapshot will formally be open in January, but we will include all results basically from now until the end of February. And what we want to accomplish is to develop a national baseline, which will then inform potential areas of risk where ISMP Canada and CPSI could work to develop interventions. And in terms of your individual benefits, I think it will help you to identify those high priority vulnerabilities within your own site. And within our online program, there is a immediate comparative functionality. So as soon as you enter your results, you will be able to see how your facility compares to the national aggregate. So there will be more information coming out by email, and you'll see it on social media, and so this is just kind of a heads up that this is coming, and we hope that you'll be interested in joining the national snapshot. Thanks very much, Ambika.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. We're definitely looking forward to the findings from that snapshot. So I do want to thank all of our speakers for the very interesting learning shared today, and we will be turning our attention to the questions we've received. Based on the time, we probably won't get through all of them, but we will try our best and then provide written answers for those we don't get to. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Ambika, and terrific discussion here on the chat board and some very interesting questions. And we'll start off with our presenter from the Methotrexate case, and I'll combine a couple questions that we received because they're mainly about communication. Our first one is, shouldn't the rheumatologist be in contact with a nephrologist directly regarding a change or introduction of a new medication, instead of relying on a patient having to communicate all this information with their dialysis team or with their nephrologist? And this respondent raises the question, what if the patient is elderly or speaks a different language? And the second part related to this is, what are the expectations of a community or non-renal pharmacist in dealing with dialysis patients, and how accessible can we expect nephrologists and renal pharmacists to be?
Hi there, it's Shana. Thank you for the questions. Of course, not very many easy answers. So in an ideal world, yes, the rheumatologist would certainly directly contact the nephrologist. That happens, if they know the patient is a renal patient. So, that is one piece that might have also been missing. Did the patient, did they check and see if the patient had kidney dysfunction? Were they on dialysis? So once they have determined that, they do have kidney failure or they're on dialysis, they should, but they don't tend to time-wise. So they give the prescription because it's, the most convenient thing in terms of being in their office right then, and give it to the patient. And then it is difficult to expect patients to let us know. We even have patients, though, who are elderly and or if they have language barriers. So on our sheets, we have them in, I think, 14 different languages when we ask patients to bring in their medications. So we say you can either just bring in the vial that has been filled, at your pharmacy, or the prescription itself before you fill it. And we do check it. Of course, renal pharmacists are available, but, in our center, it is mainly Monday to Friday, 8 to 4. But there is a nephrology fellow available at our center who's on call, and the nephrologists are on call, but you certainly can reach a nephro expert if necessary. And then in terms of the community pharmacists, I just applaud them. They do such a great job because they really often are working with no information. Some of the clues that I was in a recent giving a presentation, if a patient is on dialysis, would be, is the patient taking Replovite, or do they have sodium bicarbonate or Kayexalate filled on their medication list? Then maybe that would clue you into the fact that they're on dialysis. Some pharmacies now have Clinical Connect in our province and can access renal function. And then another piece in our province is we have the Ontario Renal Network has created a medication safety list. And so one option would be to take a quick look at that. It doesn't give all of the answers, but certainly if the medication is on that list and says it needs dose adjustment or avoid, then you would need to contact the prescriber about that. So trying to have some options for patients or for community pharmacists to look at is all we're trying to do.
And you've certainly outlined a lot of problematic issues in the way we transfer information from provider to provider. I'll turn our attention to Health Canada and the naming of biosimilars. And one question that came up is we run a number of clinical trials in our organization, and a lot of the literature we receive is U.S.-based. And some of our investigational drugs that we use are biosimilars directly from the U.S., and they do carry U.S. suffix names with them. Is there a cross-reference list of the biosimilar naming in Canada versus the U.S. suffixed counterparts? And do you foresee problems with the two different naming conventions in two adjacent countries?
Hi, yes, thanks very much for the question. We'd agree that it's important to distinguish among drugs, including biologics, even at the investigational stage. And our understanding is that the FDA approves suffixes at the point of market authorization. So a biologic drug or biosimilar would likely not have a suffix at the investigational stage, at least not an FDA-approved suffix. We're not aware of a cross-reference list, although our understanding is that biologics, from what we've seen, often have the same or similar brand names in the United States and in Canada, by and large. But we recognize that the differences in naming conventions in different jurisdictions is there, and it's something to be conscious of when identifying biologics, even in clinical trials.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know I see questions still coming in, but unfortunately we are at the end, so we will try to provide written answers to all of those questions that were unanswered. Again, I just want to present these suggestions for presentation topics that we've received from you. So if anyone has any information to share, we can work with you to develop a presentation, and it can be as short as 5 minutes. But we do think it's important to share experiences and your learning so that we can all optimize patient care in these areas. And again, we want everyone to be part of the Med Safety Exchange, so please email us to share any learning you have from incident analysis or a med safety initiative or topic. And please don't forget to fill out the poll that's available on the right panel. We'll be asking different questions each time, so please read the survey questions carefully. Again, the link to the recording of this webinar will be available on the Med Safety Exchange website next week, and a PDF of the slides is available upon request to the email address on this slide. Registration for the next webinar on Wednesday, January 15th will be open soon on the website. And thank you again to our speakers for the important analyses and strategies shared today, and to all of our participants for joining the discussion and sharing the learning with your insightful questions. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day and have a wonderful holiday season. Thanks.